Hello there, friends, and welcome to this episode 268 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. So we have covered off a couple of different things over the last few weeks, all around this idea of being an overstimulated, highly sensitive person. And today we are continuing on with that theme and talking about the role specifically of self-compassion and kindness when it comes to being overstimulated and overwhelmed. So we are going to dive into this conversation around the role of self-compassion and kindness when it comes to overstimulation. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a little while, you'll know that self-kindness and self-compassion are kind of my staples. I talk about them a lot. I talk about them all the time. The name of this podcast is SelfKind with Erica Webb. So it is a huge part of what I do and the way that I support others. And there's really good reasons for that. And we're going to go through a lot of those today. I think that self-compassion and self-kindness are lifelong skills that we keep refining and practicing and working with. It's not something that we perfect, I don't think. Like so many adult skills, we don't tend to perfect them, but we continue to use them. And so we really can't talk too much about these things because they don't necessarily come really easily to all of us, and they are a practice. So we're going to dive into talking about that. So before we do that, let's just quickly review what we're talking about when we talk about overstimulation and how that relates to overwhelm. So back in episode 266, we talked about the general sort of gist of what does it mean to be overstimulated as a highly sensitive person. And we talked about the window of tolerance and how that's a really good way to discuss and talk about and kind of visualize this idea of being overstimulated. And really, what it means is that there's like more going on than our nervous system can handle at any given time. And we can expand our window of tolerance. Our window of tolerance can shrink depending on what kind of pressures we're under. But essentially, when we're in our window, we can handle what life throws at us. We have ups and downs. We can navigate them with some level of ease, some level of capacity. When we're overstimulated, we lose that ability to just handle it, right? And we feel overwhelmed, we feel out of resources, and it can be really exhausting and really quite overwhelming. So what can contribute to overstimulation is things in our environment, lights, sounds, temperature, things that are going on inside of us, like being hungry, being in pain, being tired, needing the bathroom, self-criticism, the way that we talk to ourselves, stress outside of ourselves, big things happening, small things happening, people needing things from us or asking for things from us that we don't have the capacity to give, worrying about other people's needs, which is a really highly sensitive person thing to do, and just things that demand more time, energy, money, resources than we actually have. And when we're overstimulated, we might find it incredibly difficult to make decisions. We might find ourselves procrastinating, feeling really uncertain about what to do next, unfocused, snappy with the people that are around us, all the things. So when we sort of think about this idea of being overstimulated, it can be on a sort of smaller scale in terms of just kind of recognizing that we need to retreat a little bit and recharge our batteries. And then we can be kind of like overstimulated on a grander scale, depending on how we've organized our lives and what's going on in our worlds. So why do we want to use self-compassion as a really core tool when we're highly sensitive people who find ourselves in this state of being overstimulated from time to time, or maybe quite frequently, depending on what's going on for you? And we're going to talk about this from a few different angles, but the first one that I want to point out is that the ordinary loop that most of us get into when we're overstimulated or overwhelmed is to beat up on ourselves. And I think HSPs, highly sensitive people, we're quite good at doing that because we have very high expectations of ourselves. We have perfectionist qualities a lot of the time. And we can be very good at comparing ourselves to what we see as the norm. And so it might not be the norm, right? Because we don't have access to everything that's going on inside somebody else's mind or body. But we might look outside of ourselves and think, well, they can deal with this. They're not bothered by this loud environment. They like going to concerts. Why do I have such a hard time with this? We can kind of look outside of ourselves, do the comparison thing, and then turn back towards ourselves and make ourselves bad, wrong, and in so many different ways, not enough. So that kind of negative loop can very quickly turn into a lot of self-talk that is very cruel and very unkind and really not at all compassionate. So it would be things like saying, you should be better than this. Why are you like this? Why do you always do this? Why are you so soft, sensitive, useless? This self-talk that can kind of really run around unchecked inside your head. And I think that one of the challenges with being highly sensitive is you might have a very cognitive, clear understanding of what you could and should maybe do. But a cognitive understanding doesn't always translate into action. And it can be hard to pull ourselves out of that negative loop, especially if we perceive that that negative loop is warranted. Right? So if we're like, no, but I really do believe that I should be able to be like those other people who aren't affected the way that I am, then it's hard to pull yourself out of a negative loop because you're like, but it's true based on my current understanding. And so we don't go in sort of looking to fight those thoughts. It's kind of a futile pursuit. So what I want to point out here is like, okay, where does the self-compassion come in? And I want to point out that if somebody was standing over your shoulder, right, you're having a moment or an immediate moment or a prolonged moment of overstimulation, you're kind of freaking out. And somebody was standing over your shoulders and they were saying, you should be better than this. Why are you like this? Gosh, you're just too sensitive. You're just too much. Would that make your overstimulation feel better, or would it contribute to it and make you feel worse? It would absolutely make you feel worse, without a doubt. So why would talking to yourself like that have any other impact than to also contribute to your overstimulation and make things worse? That's why self-compassion is so important, because it is not benign the way that we speak to ourselves. It has an impact in a very real way. So if you compare that with the idea of someone standing over your shoulder and like saying sweet and kind and understanding and compassionate things to you, you're going to have a very different internal reaction. Someone standing over your shoulder and saying, oh my gosh, you are doing your best. We all struggle. I've had periods of time where I've struggled like this. Honor your capacity. How you feel matters. This is not about being perfect. You're doing a great job. We all struggle. That would feel very different. And likewise, when you say that to yourself, it makes a difference. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it just is like this magic switch that you flick and suddenly overstimulation is gone and you feel amazing and you believe all of these things without a shadow of doubt. Maybe not. But it does go a long way to changing how you feel. And part of the reason for that is because essentially, when we're saying unkind things to ourselves, our nervous system picks up on that as a threat. And so when we say kind and compassionate things, it's sort of the opposite of that. It's a sign of safety for our nervous system. It's something that our nervous system can kind of latch onto and say, oh, okay, here's a sign that we're actually safe, versus here's more evidence that we're in trouble. Here's more evidence that things are bad. So we always want to be contributing to that signs of safety pool when we can. And we do that in lots of different ways, and we won't sort of cover all of them in this episode, but self-compassion is a big one. We can create signs of safety for ourselves and anchor ourselves in that by simply being compassionate towards ourselves. So that's sort of the first piece. Self-compassion acts as this anchor, as this sign of safety to the nervous system in the face of increasing threat, which is ultimately what the overstimulation is doing too, right? We're overstimulated because it's too much for our nervous system to kind of navigate and handle in the moment. But there's a few more pieces. Self-compassion is the gift that keeps on giving. So when we are compassionate towards another person, or when we hug another person, when we offer kindness towards another person, that has a very real effect on our hormones. And it can release a hormone called oxytocin. And there is some evidence, some belief that when we do that to ourselves, it can have the same impact. So not only are you changing perhaps how you think, but you might also have a direct and very real impact on what's going on inside your body, which then impacts how you feel as well. And the thing that's really cool about self-compassion is that it is a necessary precursor to SelfKind action. So Self-kind action requires us to meet ourselves with compassion, because the compassion is the thing that kind of opens the door to the kindness. And then the kindness asks, what might I need? What would be supportive right now? That is key, because self-compassion and self-kindness are things that we do. They are things that are like active pursuits. They're not passive. So I hope that kind of paints a little bit of a picture as to why we really want to care about practicing self-compassion. What I do want to acknowledge is that sometimes when we play with self-compassion, especially if it's new, it can feel very awkward and it can feel a little cringeworthy. In the words of, I don't know, is that like the popular words these days, cringeworthy? I have no idea. But even if it does feel a bit cringy, even if you do feel a bit awkward, even if you are like, this is so strange, it is so worth it. And it's worth it to an extent that is beyond what I can really even communicate and express. But because it can feel cringy, I think it's a really easy thing to think that you're getting wrong as well. And because it is oftentimes unfamiliar and maybe even subtle in its impact, at least at the beginning, it can be really easy to think that you're getting it wrong. So I want to give you a few pointers for how to use this in a very real, tangible way so that you can go away and you can be like, right, I don't need to get this perfect for a start, but this is like, I've got some guidelines, some steps to know, oh yes, I'm doing this well enough, right? So ultimately, self-compassion has 3 elements. And Kristen Neff really talks about this. Kristen Neff is a researcher who has devoted so much time and energy to self-compassion, and her work is really incredible. But she talks about 3 kind of pillars of self-compassion. The first one being, well, actually, I don't know if they're in any particular order, but mindfulness, which is really about acknowledging the struggle that we're experiencing. The second part is shared humanity, acknowledging like, oh, I'm human, and all humans struggle at times. All humans experience these difficult feelings. So I'm not alone, right? And then the third part is self-kindness. That question of like, okay, but what will I do now? How will I meet myself with the kindness that I'm worthy of? So there's those 3 pieces. Acknowledge, oh my gosh, I'm in pain, right? Like I am struggling with this. Other people struggle with this too, because we have this shared humanity, and this is part of being human. It's uncomfortable, but I know it doesn't mean that I'm broken. And then self-kindness. Okay, well, what am I going to do now? And if that feels difficult to do, the best possible way to approach this is to think about how you would offer it to someone else. And that is something that we hear all the time. Like, imagine how you would speak to your best friend. We hear that repeatedly because it's a really good strategy. It's a really good way to think through this, because you would not stand over your best friend's shoulder or your child's shoulder and tell them all the things that they're doing poorly. You wouldn't rip them to shreds when they were at their lowest point. You would offer them love and compassion and kindness and remind them of the fact that they are doing their best, that they are worthy of rest, that they are worthy of kindness, even in the midst of that human struggle. And so imagine that, right? I actually like to imagine, I guess there's a sense of duality in this, but I like to imagine myself talking to myself, very much like a conversation. And it can be helpful to imagine that conversation between you and someone else that you love, and then turn it towards yourself. We know how to do this. We know how to do compassion. We do it all the time, but we often direct it out, not in. And of course, we want to keep directing it out. The world needs more of that, absolutely. But we want to be able to do both. We want to be able to offer it out and offer it in. And I think if you really commit to practicing that, to noticing, oh my gosh, I'm being a real jerk to myself right now, I'm going to turn towards self-compassion, you will start to notice a really big, significant impact on how that can help you navigate overwhelm. Because it's that first little place where you can go, okay, here's a little sign of safety. It gives you the doorway into taking an action that will be supportive. And when we're overstimulated, it might mean that we just need to disappear for a minute, right? We need to go into a dark room, close the door, and just decompress for a little bit. It might be that we need to tell our boss that we cannot take on that next project because we've recognized that we are completely overwhelmed. like it could be lots of different things, right? It might be deciding that you're not setting your alarm the next morning and you're just going to let yourself sleep a little bit longer, going to bed earlier, calling your friend, asking for a coffee with somebody that you trust. Like there could be so many different things that SelfKind action sort of leads you towards, but it's the self-compassion that gives you the space to say, oh, I'm worthy of that action. I'm worthy of that self-kindness. And that's where it all starts. So I hope that's helpful. I would love to know. I would love for you to reach out and let me know if that is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions about it as well, because it is a topic that is sort of deceptively simple. There's like a level of simplicity to it that doesn't really give clues about how challenging it can be for some of us to actually put it into practice. So if you come up against roadblocks, let me know. I probably have some tips for navigating them. Next week, we are going to talk about the role of self-awareness in navigating overstimulation. And all of these topics kind of overlap and intertwine and have, they're deeply related. But there will be some additional things to come in that episode that I think will be really helpful. So stay tuned for that. And until then, keep being kind to yourselves. Keep meeting yourself with that compassion. Know that it might feel a little awkward and a little weird, but it is absolutely worth persisting. All right, I'll talk to you soon.